it's Mo. I was not going to make this video because I didn't think that I had enough unique recommendations for Women in Translation Month. And that may be true, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I really wanted to make this video because these might not be the most obscure or least known books or least loved books written by women in other languages and then translated into English, but maybe you are not familiar with very many women in translation authors. Maybe you don't really watch a lot of people who read women in translation. So I think it's worth it to make this recommendation video, and we are going to start with the author that I've read the most from, definitely an author that I would love to read her entire back catalog, and that is Yoko Ogawa. So Yoko Ogawa is a Japanese author. She's seemingly pretty prolific, but a lot of her books are older and then more recently have been translated into English. So I have read The Housekeeper and the Professor. This is the first Yoko Ogawa book I read. This book follows a young housekeeper who goes to work for a man who has memory loss. He only remembers the last like 80 or so minutes of his life before he had an accident. So every 80 or so minutes, he resets and doesn't remember what's happening. And in order to combat this, he ends up writing himself thousands and thousands of little notes. Another way that he overcomes his memory loss is math. He was a math professor, and within math, he is able to keep more of his memories. And this is like a very simple story, albeit with that little bit of a dark twist that I think Ogawa is known for, about how the housekeeper and the professor become great friends and how the housekeeper's son also becomes beloved by the professor. The next book that I read by Yoko Ogawa was Revenge. This is a very short book of interconnected short stories, and again, it has a unsettling feel, an unsteady feel that I am coming to see as a signature in Ogawa's work. This one I really, really loved. It's all about one town or one area and different people in it. It takes place over different time periods, involving all sorts of different people, but all of whom are somehow connected. The third book that I've read by Yoko Ogawa is The Memory Police. This is definitely by far the most weird and unsettling. It has a book within a book aspect, and it follows a main character who lives on a very small island where the memory police exist, and they are there to make sure that the things that disappear in this town stay disappeared, and the people who supposedly have no memory of them actually don't have memory of them. So I love Yoko Ogawa's work. I can't wait to read more. All of the books that I've read from Yoko Ogawa so far have been translated by Snyder. The next translated author that I've read more than one book from is Banana Yoshimoto. She was a very famous writer, especially in the 90s. I think she was one of the first writers that her work was translated into English and really made a big splash on the American literary scene, or so it seems to me looking back at it. And Kitchen is probably one of her most famous novels. I've read Kitchen, and then in the back of this particular edition of Kitchen, there's also a short novella, a very short novella called Moonlight Shadow. Moonlight Shadow was actually written before Kitchen, and it is about a young woman who has recently lost her boyfriend and how she copes or doesn't cope with that grief. And Kitchen is about a young woman who recently lost her grandmother and how she copes or does not cope with that grief. Both stories are about how people around them help them and how through helping them, the main characters also help their friends and family. I'm super interested to read more of Banana Yoshimoto's work. I have one other book of hers, so I'm hoping to get to that soon. She's coming out with a new book. She hasn't written a new book in quite a long time. Well, okay, so she's coming out with a new book. I think it's due to be released later this year or early next year. I'm not sure if that's a book that she has written recently and is getting translated immediately, or if that's a book that she wrote a while ago and is only now getting an English translation. But either way, she hasn't had a new book out in quite a while. Moonlight Shadow and Kitchen were both translated from the Japanese by Megan Bacchus. Sticking with the Japanese translated work, the next book I want to talk about, I don't hear too many people talking about, and that is Tokyo Ueno Station by Yu Miri. This is a very short novella that I read on audio, and it is all from the perspective of a ghost who previously had had a long but hard life and ended up in a homeless encampment near Tokyo Ueno Station. This book plays with time and space, experience, and perspective. It was very atmospheric, it was very ethereal and ethereal, and I'm excited to read more by Yu Miri. I know that she has 2 more translated works. One is a shorter book and one is a longer book, but I've never really heard much about any of her work. I would definitely try to pick the shorter book first, but that's just my preference. Tokyo Ueno Station was translated by Morgan Giles. Another book that I read on audio that I really enjoyed was Penance by Kanai Minato. She's super famous for writing confessions, which a lot of booktubers really liked. Both of these books were written in the mid-2000s, 2008 and 2009, but translated into English later. Confessions is about a woman whose young daughter was murdered by one of her students, and it follows her on the last day of school as she kind of calls out these students for her daughter's death. That one never really interested me that much, even though booktubers really love it. The book that I read, Penance, has a very similar premise. It follows several young girls who, when they were young and playing in the schoolyard together, one was abducted and murdered. There are similarities in the way that Penance and Confessions are written. Each chapter is written from a different perspective, and there is information not given in those chapters to us, the reader. So the characters know more than we do. So we're kind of trying to figure out, piece together what happened by reading from these different perspectives that kind of all converge at the end. This was a pretty gruesome one. There was a lot of heavy topics and disturbing elements to Penance, but I really enjoyed it. After I first read it, I didn't know if I loved it, but the more time has passed, the more I've thought about it, and I would definitely love to read something else by Kanai Minato. I don't think I want to read Confessions, but I could be convinced, so let me know. Penance was translated by Philip Campbell. The last book that was translated from Japanese that I want to talk about is Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. I love this book. This is about a young woman who works in a convenience store, and she has done for the last 10 or 15 years, and her family and friends and people around her are really wondering when she's going to go get a real job and when her life is going to really get started. She's put under all this pressure to have a boyfriend, to find a real job, to move on with her life, but she's totally happy and satisfied doing the job that she's doing and living the way that she lives. So this is kind of about that external struggle to conform and to do what other people want, even though internally you know that you're doing the right thing. I love this book for its references to the service industry. I love this book for its unabashed appreciation of menial jobs that don't matter, because obviously there are no menial jobs. All jobs matter, and if you are happy and satisfied with your job, that's the best job you could have. It's very straightforward. It's very small, quiet, calm. There's definitely uncomfortable parts in this book, but there are not a lot of like gruesome parts or super dreadful parts, which I think is rare for Murata's work. One of the reasons that I haven't read any more of her work is because mostly I think she's known for more horror content. I love this quiet book so much, I wouldn't want the horror to color my experience with the first of the books that I've read by her. That being said, if I come across more of her books, I would definitely check them out. Convenience Store Woman was translated by Ginny Tapley Takamori. While we're in Asia, let's talk about Please Look After Mom by Kyun-Suk Shin. This is a really interesting story, again, told from multiple perspectives, told in different parts, about a family whose mother has gone missing. This is told from various perspectives. This also has a ghostly element to it, and it's a really interesting look at how different family members deal with grief and regret and worry, and I really, really enjoyed this one. Each section is told from a different perspective and a different voice, and it was really interesting to see how these family members gathered around when their mother disappears. I'm definitely interested in reading more Kyun Suk Shin. I know Matthew Sharapa loves this author, and I've heard about a lot of other books that she has translated into English, so I'm super excited to get my hands on those. Please Look After Mom was translated from the Korean by Chi Young Kim. Another Korean book that I didn't think I liked at first, but then ended up really, really stewing in my brain was The Hole by Hye Young Poon. This is a horror novel about a man who is in a car accident with his wife. His wife is sadly killed, and the man is completely paralyzed and unable to care for himself. His mother-in-law ends up moving in and taking care of him in more ways than one. This was a quiet, interesting, tense novel. Not a lot of action happens, but there's so much kind of to think about and to ruminate over with these characters, and so much to place yourself inside of, whether that's nerve-wracking for you or not. Don't know anything else by this author, but I would definitely be willing to pick more up. Like I said, this is one that when I first read it, I was like, oh, this is weird. I'll unhaul it. I actually gave it to my friend to read, and when he was done, I was like, I want that book back. I think I'm going to have to reread that book at some point. So I'm looking forward to rereading this one and finding more work by Poon. The Hole was translated from the Korean by Sora Kim Russell. The next Korean translated book that I have is The Vegetarian by Han Kang, and this is one of the books that I was like, I have to put this in my recommendation video, but everybody recommends this book. I know some people don't like it, and when I first read it, I wasn't sure how I feel about it, but I read this book in 2021, and I haven't stopped thinking about it. I think about it all the time. This is another book told in multiple sections. It has 3 sections, and each section examine a young woman who, after a disturbing collection of dreams, decides to become vegetarian. Obviously, this is very difficult in Korean society, and she is really questioned about her sanity for not wanting to eat meat. This book is never told from our main character's perspective. It's told from the perspective of 3 other people in her life, and that makes for a really interesting connection and disconnect from the main character. There are some really gruesome moments in this. This is borderline horror, I would say. This one does have a very gratuitous animal violence scene, so just be warned on that. I think that Han Kang's writing is extremely heavy and politically charged in a lot of respects. That both makes me want to read more and not read her work. But if I ever found any more Han Kang books, I would definitely pick them up. The Vegetarian was translated from the Korean by Deborah Smith. The last in the kind of Asian realm that I want to talk about, they're not actually translated works, but this author does write in Chinese and Malaysian. I think she probably translates her own work, so I'm going to just sneak her in here, and that is Yang-Si Chu. I've read 2 of her books. I read her first English book, The Ghost Bride. This is another one that when I finished reading it, I was like, oh, that's fine, but it's one that I have thought about a lot in the space between reading it. Earlier this year, I also read The Night Tiger by Yang-Si Chu, and I love the way that these fantasy historical fictions mix reality and fantasy, Malaysian and Chinese culture, and have these really interesting, compelling characters. I read both these books on audio, and Yang-Si Chu reads her own books. They're wonderful. I highly suggest, if you are going to pick up her work, to pick them up on audio and let her read them to you. So again, technically these are not translated works. Technically these were either written in English or she wrote them in her native language and self-translated as she was getting them published, but I definitely highly recommend them. If you like historical fantasy with a little bit of romance, these are perfect. Moving on to a Spanish translated work, I read Little Eyes by Samantha Schweblin last year, and this was such a weird, creepy, intense look at surveillance and social media and the possibility of where that could lead us as a society. Little Eyes follows many different people as they pick up a new toy, which is kind of like a Furby. It's like a little robotic creature that lives in your house. But the catch with this new fad is that you could be the purchaser of this little animal toy, or you could be a watcher through this little animal toy. So the toy has eyes and camera in it, and you can log on online and watch what your little toy is doing in someone else's home. But you never get to know who that person is. There's no connection besides the little toy, and these toys don't speak. So one person keeps the little toy in their house and it becomes almost like a pet to them, and one person watches from online, but never the two shall meet. It has a lot to do with like the interpretation of action and the potential to overcome language barriers and differences in that way, but it also is so weird and so creepy and so disturbing. It made me immediately want to pick up every Samantha Schweblin book that has been translated. Unfortunately, I don't know who the translator is for this book because I read this book on audio, and on Goodreads it doesn't have a translator listed, which is very strange. Since I was on the fly making this video, I did not find a translator. So if you know the translator for Samantha Schweblin's Little Eyes, let me know in the comments below. She has a couple of other books, one a short story collection that was recently translated into English, and I'm definitely keeping my eyes out for those. The next book is The True Deceiver by Tove Jansson. Tove Jansson is a really well-known Swedish author, but this is the only book I've ever read by her, and I really, really enjoyed it. This book was written in 1982, and it follows a woman who has managed to scrape along by taking small jobs in the small town where she lives. By doing that, she has managed to take care of herself and her brother, who might have a learning disability or some mental differences, but she's kind of sick of piecing together all these small jobs just to survive. So when she finds out that a rich woman in town, a rich artist, needs a caretaker and a housekeeper, she finagles her way into the job. And it's all about how she manipulates this person and her life to her own advantages. Not solely for her own safety and protection and comfortability, but for that of her brother. I really liked this book. It was really interesting, and it made me want to read more of Tove Jansson's work. From what I can tell online, there's quite a bit of her novels translated into English, but this might be on the darker side. This book was translated from the Swedish by Thomas Thiel. And last but not least, I want to talk about Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk. This was translated from the Polish by Antonia Lloyd-Jones. This book is so interesting to me. It's kind of a mystery. It's kind of campy and weird. It's kind of a political commentary on eating meat, how society is run, and the harm of animals. It's also just kind of a look at this cantankerous main character. So our main character lives in a remote village on the border of Poland, and she kind of is a caretaker for other houses in the village. This village mostly has summer homes, but she is one of the year-round residents, and she takes care of other people's houses when they're not there. She has two other year-round neighbors, and one of them dies. That sets off a chain of events that sees our lead character making unexpected friends, getting in authorities' way, pushing her own agenda to solve this murder. This book is not genre enough to be a genre fiction, but because of its genre elements, like its quirkiness and its murder mystery-ness, it is often also not seen necessarily as a literary book either. So this is a really interesting one that just has its own place between genres. I really enjoyed this, and I'm super excited to read more of Olga Tokarczuk's work. She has quite a few books translated into English. One of those is the Book of Jacobs, which is like over 1,000 pages long. So I probably won't be reading that one, but when I come across another of her work, I will definitely pick it up. So those are my current women in translation recommendations. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I mentioned here. Let me know what you thought of them. Let me know if you could suggest any woman in translation to our viewers, who that would be. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!